Hey Saints, well this video we're taking a look at Bashan, which is I guess gotten a little bit of play on YouTube recently. Pastor Paul Bagley and actually trying to think of the other gentleman, but a couple of more popular YouTube prophetic ministries has seen all this, I'll say, craziness that's going on up in the Golan Heights. First, Benjamin Netanyahu and his cabinet hold the first ever cabinet meeting up there where he declares that, the Golan will forever be Israel's, and then the immediate backlash happened with the Arab nations got together to discuss that, and they came against that idea, and then Syria made a threat and said that it's currently occupied Syrian land, and then just yesterday the UN is said to going to take up this whole issue, and I guess in between there, I think President Obama is proposing a Syrian peace deal with Vladimir Putin, and the opening phrases of the peace deal was the return of Syria to return of the Golan Heights back to Syria. So you can see, how many more Brinksman situations do we need with North Korea threatening the South China Sea with China, the armies that NATO armies now they're looping around Russia on the south side, ISIS, and this Syrian situation now with the Golan Heights and the major gas and oil finds that have happened there. It's just boiling, and the troops went into Libya a while back and nobody talks about that. So the Bashan came up in the discussion because of the Golan Heights mostly. Now I'd have to go look on a map again. I didn't bother to do it, but it was being presented that Bashan was the Golan Heights. I don't know if that's the case. I thought the Bashan was east of the Jordan River, and I don't have a perfect mental image of what constitutes Bashan and if the Golan is in there or not, but that was the context it was brought up in, as the Golan Heights being given away. Israel's, Golan Heights being declared by the UN as still Syria, and that being possibly traded for a Syrian peace deal with Putin. Benjamin Netanyahu's pretty much saying that it will never happen. So there is a lot of heat up there now as a prophetic, and so eventually what's been taught lately has to do with Isaiah 2, and I want to give you a little slightly different context than I think what's been popularized here in the last few days, because I think it's really cool and it's deep and I think it plays into something that was prophesied in Psalm 22, which hopefully most of you know is a heavily messianic psalm about the crucifixion of Christ. And so let's kind of get into this. I don't know how much reading I'm going to do to you today. I just want to open up the door to have you think about something differently, and maybe I'll tie it into some of the videos I've done in recent days here as well about what I think happens right after the rapture. I think there's some interesting stuff that's all kind of playing together here. So let's start first in Deuteronomy 32. And I'm coming here, Brother Mike that watches this channel quite a bit, and I both had read Dr. Michael Heiser's book, The Unseen Realm. And now if anybody doesn't want to feel like reading the book, there's a I think it's four-part video series where he's teaching his book on the YouTube channel Face Like the Sun. Now, I've only seen part 2 of the 4-part, but I figure since I read, 3/4 of the book, I pretty much know what he's going to say, but you always pick up little nuggets. When somebody's expounding about their book, they usually give you a little additional, so it's probably worth me watching all 4 parts. But Dr. Michael Heiser in the Unseen Realm says something really interesting, which is, God has a heavenly council, and it's made up of what in the Old Testament times was the, children of God. And in Old Testament usage, sons of God is, the term actually I'm going for. Sons of God was the angelic beings, and Dr. Heiser actually makes a lot of distinctions in here because he's basically painting an image of heaven, the ranking of heavenly beings, and then talking about how decisions are made with God, and it's really pretty compelling because he brings you into all these parts of the Old Testament that maybe you haven't considered. I hadn't considered all this stuff. Sorry about a little bit of a pause there. I don't know if you guys had heard it, but Skype makes little chirpy noises whenever somebody messages you, and it was just driving me insane. It kept just chirping. So there's this divine council made up of heavenly beings, according to Dr. Michael Heiser, which, again, he shows you scripturally how he gets there, and then he verifies it actually with a lot of extra biblical text, ancient texts that just replay the same story. And so, it's in the Bible for sure, but it was the common understanding way back in the day after the flood that this is how things happen. And he loves to get you into this Deuteronomy 32 set of passages. I'm just going to read a couple of them here. Remember, starting verse 7, the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Ask thy father, and he will show thee, thy elders, and they will tell thee, whether the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance. When he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. For the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. So one of the first things Dr. Michael Heiser does is he points out that the King James Version can't be a correct translation right in this, where the inheritance of the nations were split after the Tower of Babel, right? And they weren't split according to the children of Israel, because Israel hadn't been birthed yet, right? And so he just points to the fact that many translators now have a better rendering of this. I'm just going to the ISV because it's a recent translation from the original text. And it says here, when the Most High gave nations as their inheritance, when he separated the human race, he set boundaries for the people according to the number of the children of God. And an extra biblical text, I think it was Enoch, the children of God were probably 70 at this point. At least that's what it appears. And so, without recapping his whole book, he's relaying then, once they were given, all the children of earth were given to the shepherding, if you want to put a term to it, of the sons of God or the children of God, which we would call angels in a very broad brush stroke. This is why, and then he took for his portion Jacob, right? And that's when Abraham was called out, all these promises made to Abraham, and that promise passed to Isaac and then to Jacob and then the 12 tribes, right? So that's how the whole thing kind of happened. Now, we also know from the biblical text that, it was paganism that ruled the roost outside of, it was those sons of God or children of God became corrupt, and you got all the Genesis 6 stuff of they started sleeping, with human women. They started producing Nephilim. And Dr. Michael Heiser talks about that there's really three big, kind of fallen events in the Bible that Jesus is going to rectify. And, I think the first two he talks about was the fall in the garden. But then the Genesis 6 fall, or the deeds that are recorded in Genesis 6, where the sons of God came into the daughters of women and produced the Nephilim, or the giants. And so, Jesus has to unwind these fall events as part of his return. So there's some context. Not every heavenly being is a, quote, angel, which angel just means messenger. There's a divine council of heavenly beings, and the nations were divided unto them, and then a bunch of them, they went corrupt, and all sorts of shenanigans about, sleeping with the women of the earth and producing the Nephilim is one of those major fallen themes that's sitting there in the Old Testament, and Dr. Heiser does a great job. Again, you can go watch the 4-part series. He does a great job of really pounding that out. And then, like I say, I think he referenced he had over 5,000 extra biblical sources to what he was saying there with the Nephilim and with the fallen angels or fallen heavenly beings, supporting what the Bible already says. And he actually does put quite a bit of weight on Enoch. I think it's the first book. It's recognized that was written in the intertestamental period, which would roughly be 400 BC to when the Gospels then were written. And he comments about how the book of Enoch follows all those insights of the extra biblical texts, ancient texts about, the angels mating with women and all that. And he said, whoever wrote the book of Enoch, or whoever penned it or wrote it down at that period of time, had deep and specific insight into the historical account of what must have happened with this divine council and the fallen, well, I'll say angels, but you'll forgive me because angel is messenger, these heavenly beings. And so it's rather compelling that we get down here in Deuteronomy, verse 7 through 9. We see the inheritance of the nations, right? All the people on earth at the time being dispersed according to the number of the children, and it's not of Israel, it's of children of God. And I just want to reinforce that, children of God, in the other translations. And the King James, it's easy to see here, since Israel wasn't born, that's just a poor translation there. Okay, the next point now, because we're working our way toward Isaiah 2, the context of the Golan Heights, the discussion of Bashan, and what's all really happening there. This is kind of, building our way up to that. So let's go now to, give me a second here, Isaiah 2. Well, let's read down the first bunch of verses here. Context is always important. The word Isaiah the son of Amos saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. And it shall come to pass in the last days, and this is again, I think, why Pastor Bagley and others picked up on this, as it's the last days prophecy, that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and it shall be exalted above the hills, and all the nations shall flow unto it. Now, the first thing you got to ask is he talking about just in the day of the Lord, what we'd say the tribulation period is, but really, Daniel's 70th week, or the time of Jacob's trouble? Is that when that happens? I think that's the impression or the understanding that Pastor Bagley had, but really it's last days, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established above all the mountains, and many people shall go and say, Come ye, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Now, we've done a bunch of videos looking at how probably in Amos and in Micah, I think it was, the third temple being built, God disinherits. He talks more about that being Satan's temple than he declares it for himself. But we know these first verses here do actually happen. They happen upon Christ's return. He sits on the throne. He will rule the nations with a rod of iron, right? Ezekiel 40 through 48 talks about the division of the land to the children of Israel. It also talks about that, God's law will flow forth, from Jerusalem, which is exactly what Isaiah 2 here is presenting. And then see in verse 4, and he shall judge among the nations, and shall rebuke many people, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. I think it's pretty simple to see at verse 4, the context that he's talking about is what's going to happen in the millennial reign, because we know during that, quote, tribulation period, it's all about war and destruction. And here he's saying they shall not lift up the sword against a nation anymore. So the immediate context is the millennial reign. O house of Jacob, come ye, let us walk in the light of the Lord. Therefore, thou hast forsaken thy people, the house of Jacob, because they be replenished from the east, and are soothsayers like the Philistines, and they please themselves in the children of strangers. Now, that's a little bit thick, King Jamesy. Let's just flip over. I like using this alternate translation, sometimes the ISV. For you have rejected your people, the house of Jacob, because they are filled with practices learned from the east, and they are fortune tellers like the Philistines. They cut deals with foreigners. Their land is filled with silver and gold, and there is no end to their treasures. Their land is filled with horses, and there is no end to their chariots. Their land is filled with idols. Bow down to the work of their hands, to what their own fingers have made. So mankind is humbled. Each human being is brought low, and you won't forgive. Now listen to this. Go into the rocks, hide in the dust, to escape the terror of the Lord, and to escape the glory of his majesty. The haughty looks of mankind will be brought low. The lofty pride of human beings will be humbled, and the Lord alone will be exalted at that time. So you can see here how now the context is broadening out. He first paints a picture of Christ on the throne and ruling and reigning, from Jerusalem, but he's reminding them how he's going to get there, is that he's going to put down this last, call it the last 7 years of rebellion, and it begins here with them hiding in the rocks, right? It begins here with them hiding in the rocks and the dens, and then God will continue to put down the haughty prideful humans. For the Lord of the heavenly armies has reserved a time to oppose all who are proud and haughty and self-exalting. They will be humbled. He will take his stand against the cedars of Lebanon, and against the proud and self-exalting, and against all the oaks of Bashan. Let's stop there, because you see, this is the interesting part anyways. You got the oaks of Bashan, and you got the cedars of Lebanon. But yet, this can't just be the trees that exist in, the area of Bashan, the oaks, or just the cedars of Lebanon, because they're proud and self-exalting. So it's got to be a word picture to something else, doesn't it, saints? And so he just got done saying that the haughty and the prideful are the ones that are going to be humbled at that time. He says it in the prior verses there. And so I just want to show you something now. We're going to flip quick to Ezekiel 31, because it's kind of definitional for at least part of what we're reading there. This also is end time picturing, but this is exactly that. It's picturing and symbolic, and symbols are used consistently throughout the Bible. And so this is just drilling into what are these cedars and what might he be talking about. Just a few verses in here. On the first day of the 3rd month of the 11th year of our captivity, this message came to me from the Lord. Son of man, tell this to the Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and his gangs. Oh, I'm in ISV. It might not matter, but I'll flip back. Son of man, speak this unto Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and unto his multitude. Whom art thou like in thy greatness? Behold, the Assyrian was a cedar in Lebanon, with fair branches and with a shadowing shroud, and of a high stature, and his top was made among the thick boughs. The water made him great. The deep set him up on high, with rivers running round about his plants, and sent out her little rivers under all the trees of the field. Therefore his height was exalted above all the trees of the field, and his boughs were multiplied, and his branches became long, because of the multitude of the waters when he shot forth. If you read the rest, it becomes clear that he's talking about the Assyrian, the original Assyrian, Nimrod, and what flowed forth from Nimrod was all the satanic pagan worship systems, and he was the first Gabor, the first Nephilim, and that's why they're using these cedar trees, which there really were very tall cedar trees in Lebanon, but it's being used as a symbol because it's high and lifted up. It's prideful. Same with the oaks of Bashan. Who was the king of Bashan? We get this in the Old Testament. It was Og, king of Bashan. And he was a Nephilim king. His bedstead was 13 foot by 4 foot, I think was the dimension. You guys can go look up Og, see it for yourself. We also looked at Numbers 24 in the Net Septuagint on, I think it was the last video, and saw that as the children of Israel were coming to the promised land, all of these Nephilim kings were up on a high hill, and that's when Balak was trying to get Balaam to curse them, because they knew, here comes God's chosen, right? The chosen group that we got there from Deuteronomy 32 was going to come into the promised land. So now I think we've got a much better context for what's going on. Is in Isaiah 2, these oaks and these cedars, let's just take a look at that verse 13 again, isn't strictly just the trees. It's being used symbolically. Down to 13. and upon all the cedars of Lebanon that are high and lifted up, and upon all the oaks of Bashan. And that's what the Lord's going to put down, is these proud and lofty. Everyone that's lifted up shall be brought low. So here's a little bit of conjecture, but I think it's pretty scriptural, just in with what I showed you and what I referenced here, is there appears to exist the Nephilim kings. And when the children of Israel came into the promised land, the Nephilim were in the land of Canaan. They were in the land of Bashan. Matter of fact, before they entered the promised land, they fought against Og and in his cities there east of the Jordan. I think that was for the half tribe of Manasseh that inherited that land. And then when they came into the promised land at Jericho, was it Rahab said, we heard the deeds already of what happened to the other kings before you came, and everybody was panicking because of the children of Israel. So I think this is the reference in Isaiah 2, is he's talking about at the time that the haughty people of the earth enter the rocks and the dens and the caves, that this judgment is starting, and it's going to come down upon all the lofty, prideful people, and upon the cedars of Lebanon that are lifted up, and the oaks of Bashan. Now, I hope if you've been watching a few of my videos, that's starting to ring some bells, because forget if it was just a couple of videos ago, I think I called it, but before these things, we took a look at Revelation 6. We talked about the church being pictured as raptured in heaven in Revelation 4 and 5, and that in Revelation 6, when you get down to the fourth seal, the pale horse, you got death and hell followed him, and it was given a fourth part of the earth to kill with the sword, hunger, with death, and with beasts of the earth. And we dug into that, and that's the Therion. And these verses probably line up with Ezekiel 38:39. And after a lot of analysis, the conjecture was that that's the war of Gog and Magog, and the Therion very likely could be a reference to the Nephilim being back on earth. Now, there in Isaiah 2, we just read that the context was judgment was coming to the whole earth, starting with, and go back and reread that and convince yourself, when the proud and lifted up entered the rocks and the dens to avoid the judgment coming from the Lord. Well, what do we have right down on the very last thing? And this lines up again with the discussion where I said, I came through a long, arduous biblical journey saying that the tribulation, I believe, starts right after that sixth seal. What do we see here in the sixth seal? That the rocks and the kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, the chief captains, and the mighty men, every bondman, every freeman, hid themselves in the dens and the rocks of the mountain, and said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us, and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath has come. Who shall stand? And I just thought, boy, that's dynamite. What we read there in Isaiah 2, you got all the proud and haughty, and the oaks of Bashan, and the cedars of Lebanon, which, I'm fairly well convinced that this is the Nephilim being referenced here again. They're on earth, kind of, I'd say confirmed maybe with, if we have that Ezekiel 38:39 part correct, and the Therion of seal 4 as being Nephilim. That's where the judgment starts. That's where the day of the Lord starts, and that's just what it's saying here. From the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of his wrath has come. So maybe if you're listening to those other videos and they're talking about how, this deal on the Golan Heights is reference to Bashan, and because we see the war that's, pending on the ownership of the Golan Heights, that we must be close to fulfillment of Isaiah 2. And then they talked about how those passages there with the Lord being lifted up on a high mountain above all the other hills, they said, well, that's the third temple. And I would say, we got the context wrong. That's going to be the fourth temple. I really believe scripturally the Lord said he's going to build his temple. He's not going to enter that third temple that the Temple Mount Institute has designed. Does not fit the temple that you see the Lord picture in Ezekiel 40 through 44. The temple construction there is not what the Temple Mount Institute thinks they're going to build. And so the third temple is probably, Satan's temple. If anybody really gets stuck on that, you can message me, because we did the Bible study. It appears in the Bible to be that way. And that temple likely is destroyed at the coming of the Lord. You see the city is split, I think, into 7 from a huge earthquake. And we know when the Lord returns, his feet touch down on the Mount of Olives. And geologists have already found the fault line that cuts right through that mountain, and it comes right through the center of the Temple Mount. And so speculation is, at the Lord's return, that third temple falls into the ravine at the splitting of the Mount of Olives. And that sort of makes some sense, because the very first thing that happens then is the Lord sets up his throne, and pure water flows from beneath the throne to the hinder sea and to the fore sea, which is probably the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean. And that would all make sense then if that third temple fell into the ravine and the Lord sets up his temple. That sort of all matches. So recap now where we're at. First several verses of Isaiah 2, where the Lord is lifted up above all mountains and he's ruling from there. That's probably most definitely the millennial reign being pictured. Then you get that batch of verses starting at like verse 4 or 5 of Isaiah 2 down to 13, where he's talking about how does that come to be. And I find it really curious that he starts with the proud and lifted up hide in the rocks and dens from the face of the Lord, because that exactly matches Revelation 6:15. I'll just show you, hopefully quickly. I'm going off plan, off grid here, but it's reinforced later in Isaiah 2. Verse 20. In that day a man shall cast his idols of silver and his idols of gold, which he made, each one for himself to worship, to the moles and to the bats, to go into the clefts of the rock and into the tops of the ragged rocks, for the fear of the Lord and for the glory of his majesty, when he ariseth to shake terribly the earth. Isn't that seal 6 right there in Revelation 6? Cease ye from man, whose breath is in his nostrils, wherein is he to be accounted of? And so it's saying, don't put your trust into man. I'll just, further go with this theme that I've been building out for the last few videos. I really think the return of Nimrod is the expectation. I mean, it's the pagan expectation. It's Cyrus. It's, the return of It's the return of, that Assyrian that we just read in that prior passage, and he comes almost positive he's coming with, the current day incarnation of Nephilim. These oaks and cedars being referenced, Isaiah 2, Ezekiel 31, referenced again in Gog in Ezekiel 38, referenced again in the last days prophecy in Numbers 24. I think that's kind of a lock, although I know that stretches our human understanding right now because we don't witness giants or Nephilim walking around. And they might be, but I mean, we're not witness to them. So now I want to get down to one other, call it fun fact here. A little bit of additional insight with all that into Psalm 22, which is really, this incredible. Sorry, my eyes are giving me trouble here. Psalm 22. I'm sitting back from my screen too far. Verse 12. Let's go down. Now listen to this. This is the psalm that speaks of the crucifixion of the Lord. Many bulls have compassed me. Strong bulls of Bashan have beset round me. They gaped upon me with their mouths as ravening and a roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It's melted in the midst of my bowels. My strength is dried up like a potsherd. My tongue cleaveth to my jaw, and thou hast brought me to the dust of death. For dogs have compassed me, the assembly of the wicked has enclosed me. Now, that assembly, the great assembly, is one of those words used by Dr. Michael Heiser for how the assembly of the congregation of the Lord was being used from the Old Testament time. And so see what's going on here. The assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierce my hands and my feet. I may tell all my bones. They look and they stare upon me. They part my garments among them and cast lots for my vesture. Now that definitely happened when the Lord was crucified. Be not thou far from me, O Lord. O my strength, hath thee to help me. Deliver my soul from the sword, my darling from the power of the dog. Save me from the lion's mouth, for thou hast heard me from the horns of the unicorns. I will declare thy name unto my brethren. In the midst of the congregation I will praise thee. So, what happened after the resurrection of the Lord, he forget how it was stated, but he made openly made fun of those that had the powers and principalities that had persecuted him. I forget where that passage is. But isn't this interesting? Starting in verse 12, you get the same theme. Many bulls have compassed me, strong bulls of Bashan. Now, we had trees of Bashan before. I want to get back now to the bulls part. Okay. What could the bulls be? I'm pretty sure in the right context, it's the Apus bull that the children of Israel left Egypt. What was the first thing they set up when they didn't think Moses was coming back off the mountain? They set up the gold statue of the Apus bull from Egypt, right? And if you want to do a search for, they found the Mount Sinai in the Arabian Peninsula. Put that into Google, you'll see several different people that have traveled to the Mount Sinai area found this found the mountain and the split rock that Moses had struck and the whole shooting match sitting right there. But down below the altar where the golden calf very likely had been situated, they found all these drawings of bulls. Okay, so let's get a little history of this bull worship that came out of Egypt. The cult of the Apus bull started at the very beginning of Egyptian history, probably as a fertility god connected to grain and herds, according to Manetho. His worship was instituted by Keokus, I can't even pronounce that, of the second dynasty. Apus is the name on very early monuments, but little is known about the divine animal before the New Kingdom. Ceremonial burial of bulls indicate ritual sacrifice was part of the worship, where have we heard that, of the early cow deities, and a bull might represent a king who became a deity after death. Bam. Nimrod being, the ultimate, he was half man, half God from Genesis 10, I want to say it was, where he was a mighty hunter against the Lord. He was a Gabor, it says there. And this same, Nimrod, his wife, some say / mother, Semiramis, and the kid they had, Tammuz, that was the genesis of all the pagan faith systems. And when the languages were confused at the Tower of Babel, those pagan faith systems went all over the world, aka Ezekiel 30 or Deuteronomy 32 that we read, and they were given over, right, to the children of God to manage those population groups. And so right here we see the kings who became deity after the death. Well, who were the kings on the earth? Spiritually, it would have been those fallen, I'll say fallen angels, but you know what I mean. The fallen congregation that made judgment with the Lord, that followed Satan in the rebellion. But the kids that they had were the human-like kings of the earth. We saw that in Numbers 24. They were the rulers and that's why God had the children of Israel wipe out completely some of those population groups, because they were, the seed of the serpent mixed in with humans. Okay, so this is really cool. So that, when they made all those pictures of bulls and they worshiped the one golden bull, it's very likely we have a symbolism to the golden bull being the Nimrod of old, and all the other bulls, all the other Baals on high places, probably being representations of, the other fallen angelic beings, and then the kings of the earth being the Nephilim. And I think, we get this here with why were they worshiping bulls, is because they were symbolic of these fertility, right? A bull, you kind of get that aggressive male fertility kind of thing. And so that made for a good symbol of, those actual ruling kings. And then when they died, they became deified and then worshipped as these symboled by bulls. Now, this is really interesting. We're just going to give you one other thing because it really shows you what's going on here. Right after it talks about them becoming bulls, these after death they become deified, which is exactly what happened to Nimrod. He became Osiris. He became, the resurrecting God, right? The sun god. And then it says here, he was entitled the renewal of life of the Memphite god Ptah, or Ta, I don't know how to pronounce it. But after death, he became Oscarpus, i.e. Osiris, Apus, just as dead humans were assimilated to Osiris. There you go, the king of the underworld. Well, now, the king of the underworld returns, right? What do you see in Revelation 9? He's called Apollo, Abaddon, Apollyon, and he comes up out of the pit, and eventually, was it Revelation like 16 or something, or 17? He comes up out of the pit, but then he goes back, cast into hell afterwards. I forget how it's worded there. So isn't that cool how the pagan view of the deified Nimrod, Osiris, is symbolized as the bull, but in the case of Osiris, he's the king of the underworld, and that king, the destroyer king, is in the New Testament found in Revelation as Apollo or Apollyon. So you see how these symbols come full circle from the biblical perspective to why were the children of Israel worshiping the golden calf? Why is God so offended about them making images of the bulls? When they came into the land of Canaan, it's because they were worshiping, the deified view of the Nephilim Kings that had reigned in that land from before. So isn't that wild? Well, saints, I think, the conclusions I'm drawing is the Nephilim do return. Church gets raptured. I don't know what span of time we've got, but then we see, Ezekiel 38, 39 war there with the fourth seal in particular. I'm not sure which war is being designated by the second seal, but by the fourth seal, I think you've got the Ezekiel 38, 39 war. I really suspect, but I can't be sure, that the Therion reference there in seal 4 is the return of the Nephilim. And just as we saw in Isaiah 2 there, then after that you have the beginning of the tribulation period where both the proud and haughty of the cedars and the oaks, the Nephilim of old, hiding from the wrath of the coming Lamb, but also the humans, the proud, the lifted up, being hid in the cleft of the rock and all that. That's in Isaiah 2, but it matches spot on with where we're at with Revelation 6 and the sixth seal and tribulation starting post the sixth seal. Well, God bless you, saints. I know that was a deep one. I just think it's phenomenal because in word pictures and in history, you can go from Psalm 22 and those bulls of Bashan. What would that be again now with what we know? After the death of those Nephilim king, their souls remain on earth. We learn that from the book of Enoch, that the demons on earth are the souls of the Nephilim king because they're unredeemable. They were pictured as these bulls. And so when Christ is hanging on the cross and the situation is being explained to us there in Psalm 22, and he says the bulls of Bashan have surrounded him, he's probably speaking spiritually. He's hanging on the cross, and those demons of the ancient Nephilim that had died, and their demon spirits were surrounding him. And wouldn't that make perfect sense? As those are Satan's minions here on earth, and they were probably delighting in the fact of the Christ hanging on that cross, dying right in front of them. And I think that gives you a whole new context for Psalm 22 as well. And I just get all fired up by this stuff, saints. So, well, I think we're going to go home anytime now. Keep looking up. Your redemption draweth near. God bless.